The Middle East, one of the most turbulent regions on Earth. Though the situation here might seem like a headache to understand, strip back the layers and much of it comes down to one defining rivalry: Iran and those trying to contain it. If we remove that rivalry, one might assume that the Middle East becomes more stable. After all, that's what conventional wisdom would suggest. But what if it's actually the opposite? Ever since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, regional opposition to Iran has been the status quo. It's a reality that's drawn many of the Gulf states into a loose alliance with one another. Yet this alliance is little more than a marriage of convenience. Take Iran out of the picture and suddenly those same countries have a lot less keeping them on the same side. Differences would resurface, competing ambitions would return, and former allies would increasingly find themselves at odds with one another. In fact, that exact chain of events is starting to play out. While much of the attention has been focused on Iran, a new power struggle is quietly taking shape, one that over the long run will prove far more consequential than the one we're seeing today. The emerging Cold War between the Arab world's two dominant powers, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. For much of the last 10 years, the foreign policies of these two countries aligned quite remarkably. The Saudis and Emiratis both shared a common adversary in Iran, viewing its expansionism and growing network of proxies as a direct challenge to their security. They each opposed the rise of political Islam during the Arab Spring, fearing that revolutionary and pro-democracy movements would threaten each respective monarchy, and both turned to the United States as a security guarantor against these perceived threats. So naturally, the interests of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi began to converge. In 2015, Saudi Arabia and the UAE intervened together in Yemen to fight against the Iranian-backed Houthis. 2 years later, both countries joined Egypt and Bahrain in declaring a blockade on their smaller neighbour Qatar, with the goal of pressuring Doha into distancing itself from Iran, shutting down Al Jazeera and ending their alleged support for the Muslim Brotherhood. Much of the partnership was also built on the close relationship between both countries' leaders, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his Emirati counterpart Mohammed bin Zayed. Both men shared many of the same concerns, many of the same ambitions, and for a time appeared to represent a new generation of leadership in the Persian Gulf. Yet appearances are often deceiving, because despite their close cooperation, Saudi Arabia and the UAE were never truly on the same page. It was an alliance built purely upon a common adversary rather than a common vision for the region. Let's rewind to 1979. The overthrow of the Shah and the emergence of a revolutionary Iran fundamentally shifted the balance of power throughout the Middle East. Its leadership had flipped overnight from a staunchly pro-Western monarchy to a theocratic regime built on a completely different vision, one that sought not merely to govern Iran but to inspire similar movements elsewhere. For the Gulf monarchies, this paradigm shift represented more than just a geopolitical challenge. It was an ideological one. The new regime in Tehran openly denounced the region's hereditary rulers, painting them as illegitimate and subservient to foreign powers. In doing so, Iran had positioned itself as an alternative centre of leadership within the wider Muslim world. In the decades that followed, Tehran chose not to pursue conquests. Instead, it created vassals. Through arming, funding and training up a band of largely Shiite groups, Iran carefully cultivated an axis of proxies across the Middle East. This approach gave Iran a unique advantage. It allowed Tehran to operate in the grey zone between peace and war, applying pressure without triggering full-blown conflict and forcing its rivals to respond across multiple fronts at once. In doing so, a degree of order was established across the Middle East. Not necessarily a stable one, but a predictable one. And so, as Iran expanded its influence, other powers increasingly aligned themselves in response. Still, despite what the adage might say, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. Opposing Iran may have been enough to keep Saudi Arabia and the UAE in lockstep with one another. But with Tehran now facing crises of its own, the priorities once shared between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have begun to diverge. In Yemen, what started as a joint intervention soon devolved into a quagmire for Riyadh. On paper, the objectives were simple: restore the legitimate government of Yemen as recognised by the international community and crush Iranian influence on Saudi Arabia's southern border. In reality, Riyadh bit off more than it could chew. What followed was a war that dragged on for years. Airstrikes and blockades contributed to a humanitarian disaster, and Washington was ultimately forced to suspend sales of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia in early 2021. Still, that was only part of the problem. When you lead your country to war, you should probably expect your enemy to shoot back. Indeed, Houthi drones and missiles began hitting targets across Saudi Arabia. Water infrastructure, oil facilities, airports, you name it. If you're a fan of Formula 1, you might remember March of 2022, when a Houthi missile blew up an Aramco fuel depot less than 7 miles from the Jeddah Corniche circuit where the Saudi Grand Prix weekend was actively being hosted. If you were a spectator, a driver, or worst of all an investor, you may well have thought twice about returning for a second time. For Saudi Arabia, Yemen was no longer a question of victory, it was about damage control. Ever since the fallout became real, Riyadh has pushed for a negotiated settlement, one that stabilises its southern border and brings the conflict to a close. But Abu Dhabi views the conflict differently. Unlike Saudi Arabia, the UAE was far less exposed to missile attacks and faced little to no reputational fallout from the war. So while Riyadh was looking to end the hostilities, Abu Dhabi began backing local militias in South Yemen, with the goal of strengthening its position along the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Roughly 10% of seaborne trade passes through this corridor, and for a country whose wealth relies on shipping, ports and trade, influence along these routes is invaluable. By this point, both countries were fighting the same war, but they were no longer fighting for the same outcome. For Riyadh, Yemen had become an obstacle to something bigger. As Mohammed bin Salman pushes on with Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia is looking to transform itself from an oil-dependent petrostate into a global hub for investment, tourism and technology. Yet, such ambitions require one thing above all else: predictability. Investors can tolerate risk, what they can't tolerate is chaos. Missile attacks on oil facilities, disruptions to international events, and the constant threat of escalation all undermine the image Riyadh is trying to present to the world. The UAE, meanwhile, has chosen a different path. Unlike in Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis have already spent decades diversifying away from oil. Dubai and Abu Dhabi have both cemented themselves as global centres for finance, logistics, tourism and trade. But holding that position requires more than just stability at home. It also demands having influence elsewhere. From ports and shipping routes to partnerships and investments, the UAE has steadily expanded its footprint far beyond its location on the map. So while Riyadh naturally wants to contain instability through de-escalation, Abu Dhabi would rather turn that instability into influence. Yemen proves that, but it's not the only example. The UAE also chose to back the breakaway state of Somaliland in the Horn of Africa, investing in the development of a port at Berbera while quietly recognising Somaliland passports. In Sudan, Abu Dhabi has repeatedly been accused of supporting the paramilitary and rather genocidal RSF against the Saudi-backed government and armed forces, giving it the key to some of Africa's most lucrative gold mines. In Libya, they began supporting the authoritarian warlord Khalifa Haftar in the east against the more Islamist government in Tripoli, continuing its broader campaign against political Islam across the Arab world. So whether it's Somaliland, Sudan, Yemen or Libya, the same pattern keeps reappearing. But if there's one clear point of divergence between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, it's Israel. Ever since 1967, most of the Arab world agreed that normalizing relations with Tel Aviv would only come after the recognition of an independent Palestinian state. But in 2020, the UAE parted ways with that consensus, and became the first Gulf nation to establish full diplomatic relations with the Israelis. And this wasn't just some symbolic gesture. Trade between the two countries surged into the billions of dollars. Direct flights were established, intelligence cooperation deepened, and joint military exercises followed shortly after. It's a full-blown alliance in all but name. For the Saudis, things just aren't as simple. Riyadh has quietly explored closer ties with Israel, but it has stopped far short of formal recognition. Crown Prince MBS knows that as the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites and a much larger domestic population at home, his leadership needs to consider public opinion across the wider Muslim world in a way that the UAE simply doesn't have to. At the same time, many of the incentives that once tempted the Saudis to recognise Israel have already been delivered, without them having to recognise anything at all. In 2025, MBS managed to convince Washington to elevate his kingdom to a major non-NATO ally, secure the sale of the F-35 fighter to his kingdom along with American technological assistance with their nuclear power program. In other words, Washington gave away all the cards, so why would the Saudis decide to recognise Israel now? The simple answer is they won't, and there isn't much that can be done to change that now. All of this leaves Riyadh and Abu Dhabi in very different positions. Taken individually, none of these developments are enough to end relations between the two countries. Trade will continue, diplomacy will continue, and both countries will remain important partners to one another. But put together, they reveal something more significant. The Middle East we know today appears to be reorganising itself around two different visions for the future. On one side is Saudi Arabia, alongside a loose collection of partners in Egypt, Pakistan, and increasingly Turkey and Qatar too. Countries that, despite their differences, broadly support recognised borders and strong central governments trying to hold countries together. On the other is a new axis built around the UAE and Israel, one that shows a far greater willingness to work through local militias and separatists in pursuit of gaining influence overseas. even if it risks tearing those countries apart. Of course, the distinction here is far from perfect, and countries rarely fall neatly into one camp or another. That being said, the conclusion remains the same. Removing one source of competition doesn't eliminate competition itself. More often than not, it simply reveals the rivalries that were already there. For the United States and its allies around the world, that may prove to be the greatest challenge of all. Not containing Iran per se, but managing the consequences of a Middle East that is reconfiguring into something less predictable, less stable, and potentially more dangerous. If the divisions we're seeing now continue to deepen, the world may find itself moving towards an uncomfortable new reality. Because if the last 4 decades were defined by the struggle to contain Iran, the next 4 may well be defined by the competition emerging around it. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.